All right, welcome all to Japan in 2021, and welcome back to those of you who joined for part one of the program 11 hours ago. I'm Ryan Shaffer, president of Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. Our society is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to tending the grassroots of the U.S. Japan relationship in the nation's capital region. We do this through our Sakura Matsuri Japanese Street Festival, our National Japan Bowl Japanese Language and Culture Competition, and hundreds of other events during the year, of which this program serves annually as our first. So this is the 9th year running for this program. And since the beginning, we've been delighted to co-host with Jim Schoff and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Well, I guess that's my cue here. Sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it. I'm Jim Schoff, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome this morning to Japan in 2021. I had the pleasure to moderate our domestic panel last night here Eastern Time, where we had John Shalowitz, Marie Anchordoguy, and Keiko Izuka of Yomiuri Shimbun, to talk about events, forecasts, challenges, opportunities for Japan in terms of its economy, politics. There were some very interesting discussions, and you have a chance when that discussion is archived up on the web. You'll be able to go back if you've missed it for some reason. Some discussions about Suga's political challenges and the election map, the election schedule, and digitalization, digital transformation in Japan, and also Suga's global zero emissions push. So that was really interesting. And then that was followed up by a fascinating discussion between Ambassadors Sasai and John Roos, moderated by Sheila Smith. I really enjoyed that. It was a real combination of substance and looking ahead to some of the big issues that the two countries have to face in 2021, but also some very personal reflections of their time as ambassadors in each other's countries. So I really enjoyed that, and I recommend that to you. This Japan in the Year program is part of the National Association of Japan America Societies Japan Currents series, a series that not only supports this program here in Washington, D.C., but also similar events around the country. So we're grateful to NAJAS and to the Embassy of Japan for making this possible. I always look forward to our collaborations because it's great to work with the Society and Ryan and his team, and it kind of gets me focused on what are the issues we need to think about for the coming year. For today, we're going to turn first for a view from the Embassy of Japan's Deputy Chief of Mission, Tamaki Tsukada. Tsukada-san recently assumed this post after serving as Director of Global Issues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Many of us will remember here in DC, Minister Tsukada from his post a couple of years ago as Minister for Public Affairs at the Embassy. So we're very pleased to have him with us. We will then, after Tsukada-san's keynote opening presentation, we'll turn to our Society's co-vice chair, Emma Chanlett-Avery, who will moderate our panel on the year ahead for U.S. Japan affairs and Japan's foreign policy going forward. As a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, Emma serves as an expert resource for members of Congress and their staffs on Japan and Korea, as well as Thailand and Singapore. And she will be joined on her panel by Glenn Fukushima, Yuka Koshino, and Gordon Flake, all the way from Perth. So we're glad to see Gordon today. She'll introduce the panel when we get ready. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ryan to kick this off. But welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
All right. And so you're just a few logistical notes. You're joining us on the Hop-In platform. And I encourage everybody to poke around and take advantage of the various networking options that are on the platform, including which we've created a networking lounge. So if at some point you tire of listening to us, you can always head to the networking lounge and see if you can connect with an old friend in there. I also encourage people to submit your questions during our panel session, which you do by using the chat feature, which on Hop-In you find on the upper right side of your screen. You should have a pane or a panel up there for entering chat, and just make sure that you'll see two tabs, an event tab and a stage tab, and you want to be in the stage tab when you enter your questions. We're on the record. I encourage you to submit not just your question, but also to whom it's directed and your name and your affiliation. So with that, why don't we go ahead and commence the program? I'm pleased and honored to be able to turn to our good friend, Deputy Chief of Mission of the Japan Embassy in Washington, D.C., Deputy Chief of Mission Tamaki Tsukada. Over to you, sir.
Okay, so thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Jim, for the introduction. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this very important event. And also, thank you to the organizers for giving me the first speaker slot, which makes my job easier because I don't have to listen to previous speakers. I think this January Japan in the Year program has a pride of place among the many discussion forums in DC in the beginning of the year. So I'm really honored to be invited to share my thoughts. And before I start, I want to say that this is going to be my personal opinion and is going to be a very partial view on that from the very narrow window of my office. And my role today, I guess, is to provide a segue to the panel discussion. So I will throw in a number of items which I hope might or might not be picked up by the panel later on. So first, I want to talk about the nature, or if you like, the maturity of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Of course, the core element of the alliance is shared interest. The reason why the alliance has survived for 60 years is that there was a recognition on both sides of this very solid interest. But I sense that in addition to that, there is a growing importance of the shared value aspect of the alliance. And when I mean by value, I mean rule of law, human rights, free market, and so on. Alliance becomes stronger when we share not just the interests, but also the values. And this becomes very important when confronting threats and challenges, such as the Chinese incursions in the East China Sea, repression in Hong Kong, economic coercion against Australia, or even the recent Korean court decision on comfort women. In terms of shared value, the key test, I guess, would be whether we will be able to keep our free and open Indo-Pacific, or the FOIP, signboard up and maintain the Quad as an institution. Of course, protecting our common security interest will remain the centerpiece of our alliance, and malicious Chinese moves must be checked. And for this purpose, the Joint Presence Operation is extremely effective, and we will need to continue this on a regular basis. Now, the second point I want to shed light on is the economic aspect of our alliance. Of course, alliance cannot be sustained without a strong economic underpinning. And here I wanted to cite one figure, which is the Japanese direct investment to the US. In 2019, Japan surpassed UK to become the largest cumulative investor to the US. And I think this is very significant because direct investment demonstrates long-term commitment to the locality and to the country at large. On trade, we also hope that US will return to the regional free trade agreements, most importantly, the CPTPP. In fact, I was personally involved in the formative phase of the TPP negotiations in the early 2010s. And I know personally how powerful and creative US can be in driving and leading a new agenda, especially in the area of advanced rulemaking. So I really look forward to the US coming back as a force of good. Third point I want to draw your attention to is, of course, climate change. And I think the next decade or two will be the struggle for mastery of the zero carbon emission world order. And I think one cannot overstate the importance of this struggle, especially in the business world, because whoever gets on top of that will reap the benefit of the next $1 trillion market of the generation. And I guess the new rulemaking will be taking place not so much in the Paris/UN framework, but in non-UN forums like the International Standards Organization, or the ISO, because UN is essentially a zero-sum world. From my experience being involved in the UN negotiations. So whatever gain for developed countries will be construed as a loss for developing countries. So if we use the UN, China is going to play an incredibly backward and malicious game. And that is not what we want to spend our time on in this area of standard setting. So standards for the zero carbon emission society is going to be very important. Innovation in renewable energy technology, like hydrogen, will also be very important. So these are the areas where Japan and the US can lead and will have to lead. Another important area which will test the endurance of our alliance, and therefore will warrant deep discussion and understanding, is the extended nuclear deterrence, and especially in the context of the North Korea situation. And in fact, I think we saw important progress in this area in the past few years, but I don't know at this point how the new administration will take up this issue. So let's see how things will develop on this front. And finally, I wanted to draw your attention to the recent article by Bert Campbell and Rush Doshi in Foreign Affairs magazine on their view on Asia order, because I think that is going to form the core part of the Indo-Pacific strategy in the next administration. They draw on Kissinger's thesis on the 19th century concert of Europe. And I think the main argument was that we need to restore balance and legitimacy of the system from the setbacks of past decades. And I think that is true to a large extent. But before that, I think we will have to keep our own house in order before thinking about world order. And I think we need to be watchful about the impact of the recent, or rather the ongoing domestic political strife in the US on US foreign policy, or on foreign policy of our alliance, of our two countries, on two scores. One is that this will absorb a lot of political capital domestically, and might relegate foreign policy to the back burner. The other is that this might embolden bad guys to do bad things. Well, this is kajiba dorobo in Japanese, committing theft during a fire. So this is how I see the year 2021 at the entrance of the 2021. And I have to admit that this was a very random and desultory talk, and I may have overlooked a lot of important issues and items. And I'm sure that lots of things that I mentioned now will have to be corrected, or perhaps never even become an issue as 2021 progresses. But anyway, thank you for listening in, and back to you, Ryan. Thanks for your.
Thank you, DCM Sugata, on behalf of the Japan American Society of Washington, D.C. That's very helpful to frame our discussion right now. Welcome to the panel that is very narrowly cast, Japan's foreign policy, Asia, and the U.S. Japan relationship. I'm Emma Chandler-Avery. I'm the vice chair of the Japan American Society of Washington, D.C., and my day job is working at the Congressional Research Service. I'll be moderating the panel today. We have some very esteemed individuals here to talk about the theme we've been given over the next hour or so. First is Glenn Fukushima. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, has held a variety of leadership roles in business, and served 2 terms as president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Tokyo. Gordon Flake is coming all the way from Perth, Australia. He is the founding CEO of the U.S. Asia Center at the University of Western Australia. Before he spent time in Washington, D.C., and now at the Mike and Maureen Mansfield Foundation serving as president. And now he just tortures us with pictures of his idyllic life on the beach from Perth. And lastly is Yuka Koshino, joining us from Tokyo. But she is a research fellow for Japanese security and defense policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Previously, she served some time with us in DC at the Japan chair at CSIS, and also was a journalist for several years. So our task is to look ahead at 2021. We've had quite a start to the year here in Washington. And we will be touching on a variety of themes over the next hour. I think that we should, despite our geographical dispersal on this panel, we should probably start with the very dramatic developments here in Washington, D.C. As you all know, about a week ago, we saw a violent mob storm the U.S. Capitol, putting the lives of all of Congress, the sitting vice president, the incoming vice president, at risk, and to many eyes, putting a stain on democracy here in America. I think the Yomiuri Shimbun spared no punches in talking about what this meant for US leadership in the world as just one example. So I want to ask our panelists, how do you see this decline in US leadership? I think last night on the panel, Sheila Smith referred to a poll, and of our audience, about a third said that US global leadership was one of the biggest worries in the year ahead. So let's start at the furthest away. Gordon, how are we looking over here? How concerned are you, and how do you think it would affect the US-Japan relationship?
Well, one can't help but be concerned, dismayed, horrified, embarrassed, angry. There's a thousand kind of emotions that come out in an unprecedented moment, as we saw last week. But having said that, this comes at the end of a highly tumultuous 4 years. And so democratic societies like Japan, like Australia, like the United States, other allies in the region aren't entirely unfamiliar with what's happening. It has to be put in the context of the already pre-existing chaos. And more importantly, it has to be put in the context of a transition. I, again, shared all the emotions I just listed, but at the same time, I've got a fundamental underlying optimism about developments in Washington and how that impacts on these relationships, and in particular, how it impacts on Japanese foreign policy. And that's because there is a transition. Despite the noise and the tumult and the danger and the risk and the horrible precedents that have been set, the transition is going forward. The states duly certified the election results. Those certified election results were duly counted by the Congress, despite the horrors of that day. And on the 21st of January, the 20th of January, rather, 21st here in Australia, Joe Biden will be sworn in as the next president of the United States. And it is in that transition, I find, some degree of optimism, not just in Australia, but in other countries in the region. And that is because compared to the disruption, compared to the uncertainty of the last 4 years, even the most minimal shift to normalcy in a Biden administration would be cause for celebration. And I think you're going to see that. As someone who's followed the U.S. Japan alliance very closely, the U.S. Korea alliance very closely, and now for the last 7 years, the U.S. Australia alliance very closely, I'm keenly attuned to U.S. alliance relationships in Asia. And one of the things that I've observed in the last 4 years is that a U.S. alliance infrastructure globally is interlinked and intertwined. So when the president of the United States attacks NATO and that transatlantic relationship is weakened, that has ramifications in Australia and in Tokyo and Seoul. Similarly, when the U.S.-Canada relationship goes south, that has ramifications in Tokyo or Seoul. When the United States has a sitting Secretary of Defense and a sitting Secretary of State put an op-ed in a newspaper calling South Korea a deadbeat country because they're not paying, exorbitant fees for host nation support, that obviously has ramifications not just in Japan next door that last year rather, has faced similar challenges, but also even in countries like Australia where that's not an issue just because of the ramifications for alliances everywhere. So attacks on alliances anywhere are an attack on the alliance network everywhere. The mere cessation of that is cause for hope. It is, the old adage, if you ever find yourself in a hole, stop digging. We stopped digging in 5 days.
Thanks, Gordon, for that perspective from Perth. Koshino-san, do you want to add anything, given that you are currently sitting in Tokyo, about how Japan is viewing the United States?
Right, sure. So I do share the views on the fundamental institutions and infrastructure for U.S.-Japan alliance remains to be strong and has been strengthened over the past several years, as Gordon just mentioned. Looking at the security institutions, for instance, Japan and U.S. has increasingly strengthened cooperation and coordination in using the NSC. And there was the upgrade of the guidelines of the U.S.-Japan defense cooperation in 2015, and there after the transition into the new U.S. administration under Trump, this cooperation has developed even in the new domains like space and cyber. And so these infrastructure and institutions are there. But I would also like to mention that the past several weeks and also the U.S. Capitol invasion by Trump supporters really came as a shock for Japanese in the public level. And I think that is one thing that is very concerning as the foundation for the support of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And even before this incident, I would also like to add some data points on the polling survey that was conducted in 2020 in November, which saw, so among the countries that was in the survey, there was Japan saw the largest drop with only 41% expressing that the favorable view towards United States. And compared with 68% in 2019. And that's, I think there's various factors to that. And one is the lack of confidence in Trump's leadership, which could change under the Biden administration. But I think it's really important to consider that there's this change and shift in the public views about confidence in US. And as Japan's primary diplomatic strategy is really to keep the U.S. committed in the region and to keep the U.S. Maintain its leadership role in global multilateral institutions and regional institutions. I think I think this that what we've seen last week and also during the campaign and this division that was apparent throughout the campaign in the United States is concerning for Japan.
Thank you, Koshino-san. Glenn, let's talk about the Biden administration approach to Asia. We've got this we've got 1 week to go. We have heard now that Kurt Campbell may be serving as the czar of Asia policy, which is a new role. How do you think that the United States is going to approach Asia, particularly in this era of really intensifying US-Chinese strategic competition? And what does that mean for the US-Japan alliance? You're muted, Glenn. We've only had 10 months to overcome this technology.
Okay, right. So let me just start with a little context, because I agree with the two previous speakers. I have a mixture of optimism and pessimism. And optimism is that it's true that if you look at the Pew Research polls and the Gallup polls and so forth, that the opinion of the United States and Japan has gone down over the last 4 years. That's true, but compared to other countries, especially in Europe, in Australia and Canada and so forth, the decline of the United States isn't as high in Japan for a whole variety of reasons, number one. Number two, I think that there's a perception in Japan, certainly, that the US-Japan relationship hasn't suffered as much, in part because of the perception that President Trump and Prime Minister Abe had a good personal relationship, as compared to the US relationship with Europe and NATO. But I think the problem is that in both countries, each country has so many domestic issues to deal with. And therefore, as far as the Biden administration is concerned, we've got the internal political problems that you referenced. You've got COVID, you've got reviving the economy, you've got reducing inequalities, and you've got climate change. You've got all these other domestically focused issues. Some of them have international dimensions, but they're basically domestically focused. And also because the Biden administration's perception is that our alliances were most damaged with Europe. And therefore, I think that the high-level Biden administration attention by Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the president is going to be basically on repairing our relationship with Europe first and foremost. I think that on the more working level, there's going to be a lot going on between the Biden administration and Asia because of China, because of North Korea, and so forth. And I expect that if Kurt Campbell assumes this role at NSC, that he'll be very active in that. But I think most of the activity in Asia, as far as the Biden administration is concerned, at least initially, will be on China, because that's the first and foremost challenge. And so that's the context under which I think the US-Japan relationship should be seen. And so I think a lot, in part because there aren't a lot of huge bilateral issues that are problems right now between the US and Japan. And also because the perception is that there's not a lot that needs to be fixed. I think a lot of focus and attention will be on U.S.-Japan relations in the context of how do we work together on issues like China, issues like climate change, pandemic, North Korea, and so forth. So I think that's really where the challenge is going to be, on how the two countries can work together, given the context of, in the United States, all the domestic issues, and also in Japan, as was discussed yesterday. You have Mr. Suga, who, according to Keiko Iizuka, is not that interested in foreign policy, doesn't really have a team within the Kante that's really as actively engaged in foreign policy, at least on the strategic level, as his predecessor, Prime Minister Abe. So you've got Mr. Suga with COVID, you've got the April elections, you've got the Tokyo metropolitan elections, you've got the Olympics, and you've got the elections coming up for the presidency of the LDP. You've got all these domestic issues in Japan, as well as the domestic issues in the US. So the challenge is, how to get enough high-level attention on the political level, while we can, I think, be relatively optimistic that on the working level, a lot will be done.
Thanks, Glenn, for that context. And just to tease out a couple of those themes, pre-pandemic, Japan was really looking to stabilize its relationship with Beijing, was preparing to welcome the president for an official state visit in Japan. As we all know, Japan likes for the United States to be tough on China. But how far is Tokyo willing to go in being just as tough on China? Gordon, do you have any thoughts on that, and how much the pandemic has shifted things, and then the dynamics that have developed between the United States and China in the interim?
Yeah, let me just say a couple things. One, to echo what Glenn had just said, I fully agree that post inauguration, the U.S. is going to be very consumed with domestic concerns. The Biden administration priority is going to be COVID, and COVID, and that's as it should be. When you come to foreign policy, the most heavy lifting is repairing the relationship with Europe. But I would argue that that is something that is necessary and fundamentally needed and supported by Japan, by Korea, by Australia, by other allies in the region, because in the fundamental struggle of our day, and that is the continued questions and rising questions still about China's particular role, Japan, Australia, Korea, and the United States together need a functional cooperation with Europe. And so this notion that it's zero sum, that high level attention going towards Europe is somehow not good for Japan or Australia, kind of misses the broader picture there, where we all really have to be on the same boat in terms of that process. My anticipation is that we're going to see a lot less volume, but a lot more coordinated approach when it comes to China policy. And so you're exactly correct. Japan, out of its own concerns, has looked to Washington to be tough on China, but instead what they've gotten is a lot of tough rhetoric and very little coordination among allies, very little in the way of a strategy. And I think there is a growing expectation, given the extreme competence and professionalism in the deep relationships of all those who have been announced as an incoming Biden administration's Asia team, foreign policy team, of a return to a more normal, if not better than ever, American approach to foreign policy, despite the domestic issues that Glenn laid out. Because in the end, one of the fundamental things that was bewildering, at least from my perspective, sitting in far off Western Australia, is that American strength has always been in the international system that it helped build. The United Nations, the multilateral organizations, the institutions, the standards, the norms, the laws, and most importantly, the network of U.S. alliance relationships around the world. And the U.S. approach to China for the last 4 years has been high in volume, but also highly transactional, and has squandered the real American leverage in that process, and that is coordination with allies. So let me just add one final observation on this, which I think is extremely telling. In October, there was the last foreign ministers level meeting of the Quad, the quadrilateral dialogue between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. That was hosted in Tokyo. We here in Australia, relatively isolated from the woes of COVID, have measured the relative importance of such meetings by the willingness of our line ministers to quarantine for 2 weeks when they come back home. And so the fact that in the waning days of a highly controversial Trump administration, that our Foreign Minister Maurice Payne, that the Indian Foreign Secretary S. Jaishankar were willing to rush along with Secretary Pompeo to Tokyo to have that meeting, largely symbolic, tells you an awful lot. But I would argue it tells you more about Chinese overreach than American outreach. This decision on the part of Japan, Australia, and India to wholeheartedly embrace the Quad, was not a wholehearted embrace of Secretary Pompeo or the Trump administration. It was driven by concern about China. And that is just one of the great missteps of China over the last 4 years. They had this tremendous opportunity to do the classic make hay while the sun shines. And instead, they ended up antagonizing people far more than winning to their sides, to the point that the Biden administration is extremely well positioned because core partners in the region are looking for America to come back and again support multilateralism, support alliances, support a common approach to the challenge we all face.
Thanks, Gordon, for setting us up that way. Yuka, I'd like to talk a little bit about some alliance specifics, and I think you're well suited to do that. What are the biggest challenges facing the alliance? I would love for you to talk about the now almost overdue, although not yet expired, special measures agreement or host nation support negotiations that I assume will be upcoming soon. About the need for a conversation pretty right off the bat between the Biden administration and the Suga administration on Japan's discussions on acquiring a strike capability. And referring to something that I heard Sheila Smith talk about, not in this event, but in an earlier event this week, to what extent does Japan and the United States need to think about becoming more of a war-fighting alliance, similar to the ones that we have with South Korea or with NATO? Can you address some or all of those issues?
Right. I guess there's a lot of things that the U.S. and Japan alliance needs to discuss in 2021 or beyond. But I guess at this moment, probably one of the most important agenda would be how to deal with China. I think I would echo Glenn's point about how to deal with China is really where we see differences between Japan and U.S. approach. For instance, maybe one area that I could raise from my own research area, I've been focusing a lot on 5G and technology issues, and the goal about I think the goals between the U.S. and Japan on maintaining technological advantage in critical and emerging technologies over China is critical for the long-term strategic competition, and also the fact that Chinese digital technology, because of the Chinese technology firms' potential connection with the Chinese government, really makes these infrastructure untrustful and reliable, and the spread of these technology through China's digital dimension of BRI, like the Digital Silk Road, is a concern. But for instance, Japan saw this. I think the U.S. dealt with this challenge by more of taking a unilateral approach, such as the State Department's Clean Network Initiative to ban and regulate the use of Chinese technologies. Is not some kind of approach that Japan wants to deal with these issues. Japan has always been valuing this rules-based approach on creating an inclusive rules-based approach, and rather identify the governance gaps in digital space, like the data governance, and try to have China adapt to these rules-based order. So those are one of the alliance. I think one of the key agenda for China, how to approach China is one of the challenges. And I think there are discussions ahead about how we approach. Probably second question will be how we approach the burden sharing between U.S. and Japan. Unlike the Trump administration, I think there's this view. I think that the Biden administration will not necessarily pressure Japan to increase the financial aspect of the burden. But there will probably be more discussions about how the US and Japan can utilize the resources and the strength in the technology area to potentially conduct joint R&D programs in space or these new emerging dual use technology domain. And that could be a conversation that we might see in this alliance. But other areas, the sensitive areas, as you mentioned, there has been ongoing discussions in the Japanese government about the possibility of Japan having some kind of retaliatory strike capabilities against North Korea's missile threats. And there's also growing discussions and importance of discussing about Japan's role in cases of Taiwan Straits contingencies. But at the same time, thinking about 2021 and Prime Minister Suga's agenda, Prime Minister Suga hasn't been very active in terms of addressing security challenges and conducting a further changing security policies like adopting a strike capability for Japan. So I think we won't see much developments in these tough security discussions in Japan, but these will be the key issues and questions that the alliance need to deal with and tackle with in the next coming years.
Great, thank you, Koshino-san, for that comprehensive answer. Let's turn to the economic realm now, and I'll ask you, Glenn. As you know, after the United States withdrew from the TPP, Asia kept moving. They kept signing agreements, including the RCEP, that didn't involve the United States. How can the United States, exert its influence or restore its influence in the region without being part of some of these big economic agreements? And are we still going to be looking to Japan to play a leadership role in the economic architecture of the region?
Right. So again, I want to put that in context and talk a bit about China, because I think on the security side as well as on the economic side, I think the biggest issue between the US and Japan will be China. And I think that all during this US presidential campaign, all of the questions I received, practically all the questions I received from Japanese government officials, business people, journalists, scholars was, how is the Biden administration going to do with China? And as we all know, in a kind of very simplified way, I think Japan would like to see some level of tension between the US and China, because the nightmare scenario, according to many of my Japanese friends, a nightmare scenario is that the US and China will get together, form a G2, and relegate Japan to marginal status. That is the nightmare scenario. That's what everyone keeps telling me. So on the one hand, many people in Japan would like the US, and that's why there was such an appreciation of Trump in Japan, because they felt he was tough on China. And by Trump being tough on China, it makes China more amenable to Japan, because China needs Japan. And also the US needs Japan. And so on the one level, I think Japan, the leaders of Japan, would like to have a certain level of tension between the US and China. However, if it gets too hostile, too adversarial, then that's a problem too, because it forces Japan to have to choose between one or the other. And clearly on the security and political side, Japan's partner is the United States. But on the economic side, increasingly, China is important in terms of trade, investment, tourism, and everything else. And so there is this tension that's been developing over the last 10 to 15 years. On the one hand, the security and political dimension versus the economic dimension. And one of the big challenges, I think, for the Biden administration, regardless of whether TPP or RCEP, is how does, I think, Gordon is being maybe a bit too optimistic in thinking the US comes in and says, okay, we're back, guys. After 4 years, we've been absent, we're back, and you guys are going to welcome us with opening arms, and we're going to be able to work together. I think it's going to be a little bit more skeptical on the receiving side around the world, including in Japan. And I think that there's going to be, it's going to be a real challenge to get the real cooperation that the US would like to get from Japan, whether it's on the security side or on the economic side. Because on the security side, for instance, just last month, Deputy Defense Minister Nakayama gave this interview with Reuters in which he said, Biden administration should be tough on Taiwan, be really tough, draw a red line. But there was no mention about what is Japan's red line? What is Japan going to do? But the expectation is that Biden's going to be tough on China with regard to Taiwan. Same thing with the economy. I think the Japanese would like the US to be tough on China on the economic side, but Japan doesn't really want to play a visible role, because if it plays a visible role, there's always the likelihood of retaliation, whether it's on rare earth or whether it's on what Australia is now experiencing or what South Korea experienced with THAAD. And so there's a real tension there, I think. On the one hand, wanting to have a certain level of tension, but not too much tension between the US and China, so that Japan can, be valuable to both. And also the security side and political on the one hand, and the economic side. So with that as the context, I think that the US, because of its domestic issues that we talked about before, I think it's going to be difficult to expect the Biden administration is going to go immediately into saying, okay, we want to get back into TPP. We want to get back into this thing that we were negotiating before. I think that's not going to happen at least in the first few months. Now, I think that if it turns out that CPTPP and RCEP proved to be very beneficial for the parties involved, and the U.S. really, both the U.S. government and the private sector feels U.S. is really losing out by not being involved in this kind of regional architecture, then I think there will be increasing momentum for the U.S. to want to get back into something like that. But right now, I just don't see that there's going to be either bilateral or regional attempts by the U.S. to get involved in that kind of architecture, because the notion in the US right now is that the political costs in the US outweigh the economic advantages. And especially since the economic advantages require several years to show themselves, whereas the political benefits, or the political capital, put it another way, the political capital required in order to get the US and especially the Congress to agree for the US to get involved in a CPP, TPP, or other arrangement, that is likely to be a high hurdle, unless the agreement is so beneficial to the United States that it's not likely to be agreed to by our partners. So the short answer is, I don't think it's likely that we'll see either a bilateral or a regional US engagement in a regional architecture in Asia in the first year or two. In the longer term, I can certainly see, if the US sees the benefits of doing that, and if the US economy recovers and there's enough of a diminution of the divide that makes so many people in the US so suspicious and so negative about trade agreements and globalization, causing unemployment and causing dislocation. If those things can be moderated as a result of Build Back Better, the economic policies, as well as the infrastructure development and also the reducing inequalities, if some of these domestic economic divisions can be ameliorated and benefits are seen from that kind of architecture, I think the US could get involved, but not in the immediate term.
Gordon, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, let me just chime in there and agree with Glenn, but make an important distinction. He's absolutely correct that we shouldn't be overly Pollyannish in terms of how the US would be welcomed back when it comes to the economic architecture. Now, to be clear, from a Japanese perspective or an Australian perspective, the US would be welcomed back. Both Japan and Australia, were miraculous in their efforts to resurrect the TPP in the form of the CPTPP. And that was done in both capitals with this presumption somehow that they're holding the door open for the US to come back. But I've seen over the last year and a half, some hardening in both Canberra and in Tokyo to the notion that the US would then dictate the terms of returning. Basically, I think most capitals are saying, if the US wants to come back in, we welcome you, but we're not renegotiating it for you. You come in under our terms. But I agree with Glenn completely. And that area in the economic realm, I think, there is little expectation of America running back into becoming an institution builder. However, on the security side, and this is why I took pains to focus on the Quad, what you've seen, and this is where I think I probably disagree a little bit with Glenn. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was probably a little bit of gamesmanship on the part of Tokyo and other allies in the region, because we want the US to be tough on China, but not want to be dragged into the conflict with China. But after what's happened in Hong Kong, growing tensions with Taiwan, continuing tensions in the South China Seas, what's going on with the Uyghurs, what's happened with Ladakh, with India, and most recently, the severe penalization of the Australian economy for the temerity that the Australians had to suggest there'd be an investigation into the origins of COVID, have pretty much shocked the region. And so again, I think when you're talking about a security architecture, you're talking about the strengthening of the Quad. I don't think there is any hesitance on that on the part of Japan, on the part of Australia, on the part of India. I think they would be welcoming the United States. And in fact, there's an anticipation that the U.S. would come back in a much more proactive way than it had in the past.
No, I agree with that. My point is that the U.S. will have expectations on countries like Japan to do more on the security side. And it may not be, as was mentioned by Yuka, in terms of paying more money, but I think that precisely because the U.S. sees that these other countries consider China to be a threat, therefore the expectation is that these countries should elevate their engagement. And to what extent Japan is willing to do that, and I'd like to ask Yuka-san how much we can expect that. Anyway, sorry, Emma.
All right, I love it. I love the engagement on it. Yuka, did you want to respond at all, or should I go to the next set of questions?
Right. Maybe I can make several points about Japan's diplomatic strategy on free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think it's also important to strengthen the fact that because of the lack of U.S. leadership role in the region during the Trump administration, Japan took the leadership role to come up with this regional kind of strategy building called the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. And basically, it's a Japan's diplomatic and it's perceived as a security strategy, but it's actually Japan's diplomatic and economic strategy laid out by former Prime Minister Abe in 2016 to maintain and promote the rules-based liberal order in Japan's strategically important region in South Asia and India. So in that sense, Japan is playing a more of a proactive role and to really uphold the rules-based order in the region in the absence of U.S. or U.S. kind of America First approach under the Trump administration. Also important to note that this FOIP vision is continued by Prime Minister Suga, committed to continuing this FOIP vision. And the three key unstated goals in the vision is also important to note. One is to counter China's growing assertive military and economic activities. But second is really to glue the United States to the region at a time, as I mentioned, with a lack of US leadership. And thirdly is to also to very new attempt to explicitly include India in the regional construct. So that's kind of like a proactive approach that Japan has taken. And as Suga visited Vietnam and Indonesia in September, and also what Gordon mentioned, but the second foreign ministers meeting that was held in Tokyo really suggests that Suga is continued to take leadership role in upholding this liberal rules-based order in the region as an Indo-Pacific nation, which he really explicitly mentioned in his speech and in his visit to Vietnam. But and also just wanted to note several key issues, that key events that maybe we could watch in 2021 in terms of Japan's diplomatic activism. One is the effort in Japan Mekong Summit, which will be held in Tokyo for the first time in the last 3 years. And another key event is Tokyo will also host the Pacific Island meetings in Tokyo. And these are really efforts to counter China, because the counter China strategy to really work bilaterally with regional countries to really use its geo-economic and geopolitical power. But instead, these efforts are a sign that Tokyo is trying to diplomatically enhance the resiliency of these regional countries so that they can act with the like-minded grouping sub-regions in the region, like the Mekong in Southeast Asia, rather than individually working and dealing with Chinese issues. So I would just wanted to push back a little bit on Japan's active role in the region.
I think you bring up a couple of themes that are worth exploring now, and that is ASEAN and Southeast Asia. And I think relatedly, the Biden administration is coming into office pledging to pay more attention to human rights and to democratic practices and in the region. And it also suggested doing a sort of summit of democracies. And this is one of the questions that Ambassador Zumwalt has brought up in the context of this. Japan, are they willing to be more aggressive on promoting human rights and these values, particularly in Southeast Asia, where, at least from my perspective, there's been a sort of downward trend in terms of democratic practices and the rise of more authoritarian leaders? Is Japan sort of willing to travel that path with the United States, if that's indeed the way that the Biden administration goes? And that doesn't have to be just to Yuka, but maybe Gordon, being the closest to Southeast Asia, might comment on that.
Well, I'm actually really keenly interested in Yuka's views on that, given that she's in Tokyo right now, and in the COVID environment. I've been banned from Japan for the first year since 1995, I think. I had a very interesting interview with a Canadian reporter today, and there was a similar kind of line of questioning. Should Canada and Australia be worried that somehow the new American approach towards China and a tougher line on China is going to somehow drag them into a more difficult position and require more of them? And that's entirely possible, depending on how things turn out, right? Obviously, an America that is leading on climate change rather than dragging its feet is going to put more pressure on even allies like Japan and Australia, which have been in other areas ahead of the United States, might quickly find themselves behind. And so, but that's a much more traditional position for both these countries to be in, right? I mean, there's not been an awful lot of gaiatsu in Japan right now. It's really been a remarkable period of history. In my 35-year professional career, I would think that Japan has been playing much more the role of the leader, pulling the United States, encouraging the United States, rather than responding to American pressure on this front. So the notion that we might get back into an era where a focus on democracy, on human rights, or even a broader and more coordinated strategy on pressure on China would be difficult for Japan or Australia or Canada, it is actually absolutely true. It will be. There will be elements of that. But if you put that in the context of where we are today, I would choose to focus on the fact that almost all those issues are being faced by these countries already today, and they're done without American leadership. They're done without coordination. They're done without support. And so if you're Canada and you've got, Michael Korvik and Michael Spavor, and they're being held, you haven't felt a lot of love from the Trump administration and pushing on those fronts. If you're Australia and you've been under this tremendous economic pressure from China, there's celebrations down here when Jake Sullivan just sent out a tweet saying, we got your backs on this one, right? I anticipate that the first order is going to be, for all these countries, a sense of common approach, a sense of greater coordination, a sense of greater communication and cooperation before you get to the point where you're worried about the U.S. leading again. And then if I factor in Glenn's splash of realism here, the U.S. is going to be in a world of hurt on a lot of other domestic issues here. So of all the worries that we should be talking about right now, that the worry that the U.S. is going to move too fast to make Japan and Australia and others uncomfortable because they're dragging us along, I think it's going to take us a while to get that organized and to get ahead of them. So far, the U.S. is behind. So,
can I make a comment? I was one of the people responsible for starting Human Rights Watch Japan about 15 years ago. So I've watched the human rights issues in Japan with some interest. But I agree with Gordon overall. But one of the things that I find very interesting is that the EU on December 2nd came out with this very comprehensive proposal to the Biden administration of how the EU and the United States can work together. It had 4 parts to it. The first was health, including especially COVID. Secondly was climate change. The third was trade and technology. And the fourth was security. But in each of these dimensions, the EU really emphasizes values, democracy, human rights. And I think there's a real attempt by the Europeans to try to embrace the Biden team and to say that it's really the EU and the US who have the values, the common values, the common views towards democracy and human rights and so forth, and therefore we can work together. So in that context, I agree with Gordon. I think Japan certainly is very concerned about human rights in Hong Kong in particular. But I do think that the Japanese approach to human rights is fundamentally different from the US approach to human rights. It became very clear during the Carter administration and during the Clinton administration as well. And I think that that is an area where there may be some uncomfortableness on the part of Japan if the Biden administration does in fact emphasize human rights as a central core of its, and in some case, I think that there's a likelihood that this administration will kind of overcompensate for the fact that over the last 4 years, there's been such inattention by the United States given to human rights. So that is an area that, with regard to Japan in particular, I am a little concerned about, that Japan may think that the US is going too strongly in that direction. Probably, I wouldn't think that Australia would consider it such a problem, but I think Japan, there is considerable sensitivity. But I'd be interested in Koshino-san's view on this.
Right. If I may jump in on this, and I think Glenn and also Ambassador Sasai in previous session has really described it very well about how the Japan's approaches to uphold these fundamental values on democracy, upholding democratic values, or supporting the human rights is fundamentally different from the U.S. approach. And I think from Tokyo's point of view, calling out China or specific countries or putting sanctions which could also be seen as more of like a punitive measure, is not the approach that they want to go forward with. And also looking back history, I think Tokyo's approach, although this has not been discussed a lot, and probably Japan is not really good at really communicating well with what it's trying to do in these fields. But I think an example in Southeast Asia, for instance, is Japan's longtime investment using the ODA to support the democratic institutions in Southeast Asia, like sending legal experts to Vietnam or Myanmar or Cambodia to basically support and write and craft their civil laws in the region. And I think there are also examples of the invitation of the young Cambodian political leaders to Tokyo, more specifically to Nagatacho, to kind of see and experience in Japanese democratic system. And those are kind of like the ground efforts that the grassroots effort that I think Japan has been really focusing on and made some achievements. So it's really about the approaches. I think that's very different and probably not very well understood maybe by the United States counterpart. But I would also like to mention that there is a growing sense in the policy community and the expert community in Tokyo that Japan really needs to step up more in the stance on China, especially in the issue of human rights and democracy. And I think another interesting changes that I've seen over the past year is even the public level. I think the perceptions towards China has also significantly changed. And I think the recent polling by Genron, for instance, 90% of the Japanese people have unfavorable view on China. So in terms of the base of changing policy, I think it's about the right time for Japan to be a little more vocal on these issues.
It looks like Gordon still got some things to say, and then I'm going to draw us into a different line of questioning. You're muted, Gordon.
A quick clarification on that, and that I agree very much with what Yuka said and Glenn said when you're talking about human rights in the abstract. But again, if you look at just the last year alone, Japanese reactions to Hong Kong, where they've got deep relationships in history and investment, Japanese reactions to increasing pressure on Taiwan, the relative profile of the issues in Xinjiang in Japan compared to, say, almost any other country in Asia is higher, right? If you look at Japanese level of understanding about Chinese interference in Australian domestic politics and university sectors and things like rare earths. They're not necessarily human rights on that level, but I just think there's a level of awareness and a level of proactive response in Japan that didn't exist before and probably still doesn't exist if you just talk about human rights in the abstract. But when you talk about Ladakh in India, or you talk about Taiwan, or you talk about Hong Kong, my guess is Japan is in a fundamentally different place than it would have been even a decade ago. So.
Well, the fact that we've had this much exchange on this, I think, means that there's a lot to look at in the years ahead of how we coordinate our approaches. But I would like to make sure that we do not ignore the Korean Peninsula in this session. First, because all of this discussion about how we coordinate our strategies could all be disrupted, and all attention could go to North Korea if they indeed launch another provocation in the coming months. So that as a warning, but also looking at South Korea. First of all, we're looking at the worst state of relations between Tokyo and Seoul in decades and decades. Can anyone offer any hope, any indications of a brightening ahead or prospects for trilateral cooperation? Beyond that, I'm going to throw out a bunch of questions on South Korea. Gordon, you seem to be very gung-ho about the prospects for the Quad. Where is South Korea? They're obviously not in the core group of the Quad, although they are a thriving democracy with maritime interests. So where does that leave them? Jim Schoff also has asked about this prospect of any better relations and ways that our core allies can work together in 2021 or beyond. And I welcome any of you to offer thoughts on Korean Peninsula.
Well, I can say that is it okay? So I'm also quite concerned personally, because I have a lot of friends in South Korea and in Japan, that the two countries are at such a bad state of affairs now. I think that during the Trump administration, there was a view that maybe not official, but unofficial, that if there are disputes between South Korea and Japan, then it's their problem to solve, that the US really doesn't have much of a role, except when it came to the South Koreans threatening to withdraw Dusomia. At that point, the US DOD in particular got very concerned. However, short of that, I think for a year and a half, the Trump administration really didn't pay much attention to this issue, which I think had the Trump administration gotten more involved earlier on, around the time that the court came out with a decision on the forced labor. Around that time, if the US has gotten more involved, I don't think it would have escalated to the point that it did between Japan, with sanctions going back and forth and so forth. But I think that one of the, fundamentally, structurally, given the two governments in place, the orientation of the two governments in place in South Korea and Japan, I don't think we can expect to see a lot of progress in the short term. However, I do think that Mr. Suga is probably seen by the South Koreans as being more pragmatic, less ideological than his predecessor, number one. And number two, with the Biden administration, I think Tony Blinken is someone who said repeatedly, publicly, that when he was Deputy Secretary of State, he would always make it a point to coordinate closely with his counterparts, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in Japan and in South Korea. And he, that really values the need for the two countries to work together. I'm sure Kurt Campbell feels the same way. And actually, President-elect Biden himself in December of 2013 visited Tokyo and South Korea, met with Prime Minister Abe and President Park, especially mentioning Yasukuni and the comfort women issue. So I think that if there's one kind of ray of hope, I think that the incoming administration will try, and not to do it in a heavy-handed manner, which could result in kind of counterproductive reactions from the two countries, but more kind of beneath the surface, more behind the scenes attempt to try to get the two countries to cooperate more with each other. So I'm hopeful of that.
Yep, sorry, Emma, looks like you're muted this time. Do you want me to go, or do you want, Koshino-san, do you want to add to that first before I have a tendency to prattle on too long? Do you want to go first?
We have about 5 minutes, just as a warning.
I think Gordon, you can go first.
All right, so let me just very briefly say, Glenn is exactly right. There's probably no area in the world that has suffered more from a lack of U.S. leadership than that relationship there. Traditionally, again, even if you don't use that kind of over the top, paternalistic sounding kind of notion of adult supervision, the lack of U.S. interest, the lack of U.S. pressure in South Korea and Japan has kind of let the situation deteriorate much more than it would have otherwise. It would always have been difficult. It always is difficult, but that really has been difficult. I'm not overly optimistic, given the fact that of all the relationships where I'm pretty optimistic that a Biden administration returning to some sense of normalcy will be welcomed with open arms, South Korea is not necessarily one of them, because on the one hand, where they've had these deep disputes over burden sharing, the cost of the alliance, which have been carried out in a very public and very damaging way. On the other hand, given the fact that the Moon Jae-in administration has a single priority, and that's on North Korea, and Donald Trump just kind of let them play, and went on with his delusions on that front, and they don't want that to end. So an incoming Biden administration is likely to be less confrontational on alliance issues, but also more realpolitik, if you will, on the very real threat that North Korea poses, not just to South Korea, but to other allies like Japan, Australia, and the United States itself. And so I think South Korea is ambivalent about that. And that relationship isn't going to be as clear-cut a win for an incoming Biden administration as it would be with Japan or Australia, et cetera. The only bit of optimism I'll throw in on this, and that is when Korea is active and engaged in multilateral and thinking as global Korea, the spectrum of issues on which it can cooperate with Japan is greatly expanded. When Korea is, as it is now, narrowly focused only on North Korea and history and blood, there really is no room for a relationship with Japan. And so in the last 4 years, where the United States itself was increasingly bilateral and make America great and America first and transactional and anti-multilateral, it was pretty hard for us to expect South Korea to do anything above and beyond that. And my hope is, as the US re-enters the multilateral arena, that Korea will be encouraged to join it in expanding in the scope of issues in which they're engaged, thereby expanding the scope for potential cooperation with Japan.
Okay, Yuka, I'm going to give you the last word because the future is female. We only have a couple of minutes to wrap up here, but go ahead.
Thank you. Probably I'll just add several very brief comments about Emma's question about where South Korea and the Quad. I think that one of the unfortunate thing about Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific was that it was viewed as a security construct, while it actually has an economic connectivity. I mean, economic pillar was actually the most advanced pillars within the FOIP. And South Korea's new Southern policy, which also focused on enhancing economic and investment ties with Southeast Asia or India, actually has a lot of overlap. So just this notion of this security heavy approach, and also Quad being Quad is seen as kind of like a security coalition, I think lost some opportunities for engagement with South Korea. And looking at the discussions around Quad, it's not just about dealing with security issues, but it's also trying to discuss the supply chain resiliency in the region, or discussing the technology issues. And South Korea is a very important technology power in terms of semiconductors or smartphones or electronics. And I think on that side, on the technology front, I think we could be a little bit more optimistic about future cooperation with South Korea and Japan.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're going to need to wrap our hour up here. For Yuka and Gordon, I hope you have either a cup of warm milk or a cocktail in your future as you go to bed. I've got a day of distance learning to supervise, ahead of me. So we're going to wrap it up, but I'd like to thank the Carnegie Endowment, the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. for giving us this time to talk about Japan in 2021. Thank you, everyone.
All right, and let me echo Emma's thanks to Carnegie Endowment, but also return the thanks to you, Emma, and Yuka Koshino, Glenn Fukushima, and my former boss, Gordon Flake. We give you a pretty broad mandate, but you were literally and physically all over the map, but in a very good way. I think you achieved the goal. We're just about adjourned. I would like to invite you all to remain on the Hopin platform, where you can continue to take advantage of the networking features for the next hour or so. Let me also extend my thanks again to my co-host, Jim Schoff at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, but also our funder, National Association of Japan America Societies, and the Embassy of Japan. Thanks also to my Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. Individual members and corporate members, particularly our Yokozuna level corporate members, Panasonic, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Astellas, and ANA. If you're not a member of Japan America Society of Washington, D.C., I encourage you to please become one, take advantage of programs like this, our online Japanese language courses, and many other opportunities. And finally, a thanks to my colleagues, Mari Fromell and Olivia Kent, and on the Carnegie side, Alexander Taylor, and again, Jim Schoff. And with that, thanks to all of you for being with us, both last night and again this morning, and we are adjourned. See you next year.